The whole thing is so incredible. The whole story is so amazing, so remarkable. And this is Los Angeles. This is black magic. This is the founding of NASA, of Jet Propulsion Laboratories. What isn't in this story?
The craters and mountains of our moon bear the names of giants of science, figures like Archimedes, Kepler, and Copernicus. There is also a crater honoring someone called Jack Parsons. There are some who would rather he had been forgotten. Perhaps that's why his crater is on the dark side of the moon.
He was a maverick rocket scientist, okay? He was also a maverick rocket scientist spiritually.
This father of American rocketry was also an occultist, devoted to a path still widely misunderstood and feared.
So the founding of modern rocket science is absolutely allied and connected with black magic.
Only its detractors would call it black magic. For Parsons, this was his spiritual path, as it is for its initiates today. His scientific legacy continues. So does the puzzle of his death. On June 17, 1952, at 5:08 in the evening, a powerful explosion shook tranquil Pasadena, California, and so ended the life of 38-year-old Jack Parsons. In life, Parsons was an enigma. His death reads like a pulp fiction mystery.
Was it an accident? Was it suicide? Was it murder? Was it a strange occult ritual gone wrong? Each world of Parsons that Parsons inhabited has its own ending. The occult world has him summoning up a demon. Perhaps his rocketry world has him perhaps making an accident from playing so fast and loose with his chemicals. His Los Angeles world has him being murdered in a kind of a film noir manner.
The only way to unravel the mystery of his death is by finding a path through the labyrinth of his life. He was born on October 2nd, 1914, at Good Samaritan Hospital in Los Angeles. Jack was just a nickname for the child whose birth certificate reads, Marvel Whiteside Parsons. When his parents moved here from the East, Los Angeles was in the midst of transforming itself. It was Tinseltown, the place where America would dream its dreams, and where no dream would be too far-fetched. It was a city with a booming economy, a burgeoning population, and rampant corruption. His parents divorced in 1915. Infant Jack and his mother moved from here to live with her very wealthy parents in their mansion in nearby Pasadena.
One has to take oneself back to the 1920s, when Pasadena was probably the most, or the richest city in the United States.
Surrounded by palatial dwellings, Lucky Jack was raised in privilege. The apple of the eye of a well-off, politically connected family.
Down the street there were houses which were made to look like Algerian palaces. There were houses which looked like English stately homes. There were all manner of different architectures going on there. And Parsons, being a young child in the 1920s, was brought up in this. Now, unfortunately, when the Great Depression came, his grandparents lost their fortune, and he was made destitute. But he always retained this sense of fantasy of this world of possibility that surrounded him, always remained, I think, in his mind.
Infinite possibilities opened before him. Nothing seemed out of reach. Young Jack dreamed of space and rockets. He would later say it was during this time he tried to summon the devil, and that one night, the devil came. Perhaps frightened by this diabolic apparition, his occult endeavors soon took a back seat to his dreams of building rockets.
At the time, in fact, the only place where rockets as a scientific innovation were actually discussed was in science fiction magazines. Now, Parsons thought that actually rocketry could take place in the real world. He and various other young men, literally in their late teens and early 20s, stretched across the world, were all looking into rocketry as a science, and they had all been spurred on by reading stories by Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and the pulp science fiction magazines like Astounding Science Fiction. And Parsons had always been, I guess, interested in traveling in leaving the world, into somehow escaping the world in which he lived.
At Washington Junior High School, he made a lifelong friend in Ed Foreman, and the two of them would head off to nearby Arroyo Seco to launch their increasingly ambitious homemade rockets.
And when the Great Depression comes in 1929, Parsons is 16, 17, he suddenly realizes he has to work to not only support his mother, but also his grandparents, who had lost everything in the crash. He worked from his late teens in a variety of, they were called powder companies, creating dynamite and gelignite in giant vats in these shantytown villages on the West Coast. He's just doing donkey work, but all the time he's watching and listening and learning about explosives. And it was really through a process of experimentation that he came about working on rocketry as a science. It was very much steal some gunpowder or some dynamite from the factory, take it back home, go into the backyard, start fiddling around with it, and see what you can do with it.
By 1935, the self-taught Parsons and Foreman decided they needed greater scientific expertise if their experiments were to go any further. And there was no better place to find that expertise than the California Institute of Technology. They were not greeted with open arms. Rockets were considered a subject fit only for pulp fiction. Eventually, they found at least a little support for their research at Caltech's Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory.
These two guys, without any real scientific training, turn up at Caltech one day and ask around, and they ask if anybody's doing anything in rocketry, and of course, they're laughed at. But then they happen to come under the wing of one of the mavericks of Caltech, Theodore von Karman, who was the professor of aeronautics at the time in Caltech.
Van Karman introduced them to one of his graduate students, Frank Molina. Together, Foreman, Parsons, and Molina would become the nucleus of Caltech's Rocketeers. With only moral support from the university, they were forced back to Arroyo Seco to continue their tests. Eventually, successful experiments would regain them admission to the campus. Professor Judith Goodstein is a historian of science and Caltech's archivist.
After the successful test in the Arroyo, the Rocketeers came back and were able to try out different techniques in this building. And one of the most unsuccessful or most famous involved attaching to one end of a very long cord, a cord that was suspended from the third floor of this building to the basement. At the end of the cord was a small rocket engine and some fuel. Unfortunately, the fuel exploded. And it was a combination of NO2 and alcohol, and it left, beside a very large noise, it left a thin layer of rust over all of the equipment in the building. And as a result, the Rocketeers were banished from this building.
Well, somehow they managed to live pretty much a charmed life throughout all these explosions. There was one incident when they had been thrown out of the aeronautics building where their first experiments had taken place. So they'd been forced to build a corrugated iron shed outside. And they were doing an experiment with a rocket in this corrugated iron shed. when suddenly an explosion ripped through the shed, throwing Parsons out of the shed onto the floor and sending these bits of incredibly sharp metal flying through the air, narrowly missing one of the members of the team. Now, that was about as close to death as they came. Somehow, through probably exuberance and sheer kind of youthful good luck, they managed to survive.
Accidents led to our Rocketeers being tagged the Suicide Squad. But despite the mishaps, their experiments were feeding the science fiction dreams of the era. And science fiction had a growing group of devotees. On the first and third Thursday of each month, chapter number 4 of the LA Science Fiction League met here at this landmark, Clifton's Cafeteria. Among the writers that gathered at Clifton's were the fathers of modern science fiction, like Robert Heinlein, Ray Bradbury, and a young Forrest J. Ackerman.
Jack Parsons came to one meeting of the Los Angeles Science Fantasy Society. I remember him, he was a striking, black-haired young individual. He mainly entertained us speaking about the potential of space travel.
While LA science fiction writers and fans continued meeting twice a week in the surreal ambience of Clifton's Cafeteria, another of Parsons' boyhood enthusiasms was about to reawaken.
Well, Parsons' other interest seems strange to us now, but in Los Angeles at the time, it wasn't quite as strange as it may seem to us looking back. Los Angeles was a hotbed of spirituality at the time. And he happened to come across this group called the Ordo Templi Orientis. Now, that's the Order of the Temple of the East.
This organization had come to prominence under the leadership of the British magician Aleister Crowley. Crowley was no rabbit-out-of-the-hat type of magician.
He very much believed he could use magic, a kind of old-time magic, to get in contact with forces on a different metaphysical plane to the reality in which we live. Aleister Crowley was many things. He was a poet, a mountain climber, a magician, a con artist, a charismatic leader. He was, as Somerset Maugham once wrote of him, because Somerset Maugham knew Crowley at the time, he said he was a fake, but not entirely a fake.
Aleister Crowley is the most famous and the most infamous magician of the 20th century. He was infamous for reasons that today probably wouldn't make him very infamous. But in his day, he was vilified as the wickedest man in the world, the man we'd like to hang. People accused him from everything from sodomy to cannibalism.
Now, at times, he often used his self-proclaimed genius at magic to lead people astray, to take their money. But one can't down him entirely. He was a devil, but he was a devil with belief. And he was a man who was incredibly intelligent and had devoted his entire life to the study of magic.
In January of 1939, Jack Parsons and his wife Helen found themselves participating in an unusual ritual which, they would later discover, was the central religious ceremony of Crowley's Ordo Templi Orientis. The Order's lodges continue these practices today. This was the threshold of Parsons' initiation into the world of magical theory and practice. He would soon discover this was only one ritual. The magician has many tools and ceremonies, each with its own purpose.
Some of the rituals that we perform as magicians are rituals of the pentagram, which are elemental rituals, and these are either banishings or invocations. A banishing essentially creates a clearing or a context, a balanced 0 point, if you will, whereby we then invoke or call in a particular energy into that area of possibility, what we refer to as chaos. We then invoke the energies of the gods, who then compel certain spirits that are evoked to act as the agent of the magician.
No doubt, the rejection of sexual hypocrisy in Crowley's enterprise was attractive to Parsons. But more than anything, he was excited by Crowley's explicit goal of harnessing the method of science to the aim of religion. This approach allowed for a psychological explanation of the magician's arcane ceremonies.
This particular spirit has been known to be helpful in this kind of a thing. I evoke that spirit to visible appearance. And I know in my heart of hearts, and when I'm writing in my diary at the end of this operation, I know it's a psychodrama. I know I'm dealing with things inside myself. I know the demon is my own shortcoming or psychic knot that I have to unravel. I realize it's all in my head. But during the ceremony itself, I play into it because it's an art form. It's a dramatic art form. And for the duration of the ceremony, that spirit is real.
All in all, Caltech's academic board might still have been reticent to embrace the science of ritual magic.
Of course, it would have been hard to see that, seeing Parsons attend one of the O.T.O's rituals, and you see people, reciting these very, purple prose like Osiris and Horus and calling on all the gods of ancient Egypt, and then seeing him kind of working hard on a rocket. It would obviously seem a little strange to us, but I don't think in his mind it was at all.
Parsons was passionate about his rocket experiments as well as his magical explorations. For most people at the time, both were nothing more than fantasies and science fiction. All that would change with the outbreak of war in Europe. Not even science fiction proved too far-fetched in the search for new military technologies. Caltech was approached by the government to develop something never before attempted: a device to help shorten the distance heavily loaded planes needed to take off in combat zones. Every other aeronautic group had said it was impossible. Van Karman thought the Suicide Squad might just have the answer: a rocket-assisted takeoff, though they couldn't use the R word.
Now, in 1939, when they got a serious contract to do this kind of work, the word rocket was really not held in high repute, and people thought it was science fiction. And that's why they used the word jet. So it's the jet-assisted takeoff.
For the Suicide Squad, it meant they were going to be paid for what they loved to do. And more than anything, they were for the first time being taken seriously. Soon, they were being taken so seriously, in fact, that when one of the most high-profile political trials in U.S. history made it to the courts, it was young Jack Parsons who was called as an expert witness. In a story as strange as ours, no one should be surprised at unlikely coincidences. A year earlier, concerned citizens had approached Clifford Clinton, a man known for his honesty and social conscience. They wanted to enlist his aid in doing something about the massive corruption at City Hall. This indeed was the same man who owned the cafeteria where the science fiction buffs met. For his trouble, Clinton ended up in a wheelchair when his home was dynamited. That didn't stop him. He had already hired Harry Raymond, a private investigator. Raymond's investigation, however, came to a sudden halt when a car bomb almost killed him as well. There was strong evidence that Captain Earl Kennett, head of police intelligence, was responsible for the bombings. Kennett, along with 2 of his detectives, was arrested. More importantly, if they were found guilty, the trail would lead straight to Mayor Shaw's office. Parsons reconstructed the bomb from fragments at the scene. Evidence from the crime provided all the clues he needed to determine the identity of the explosive mixture. The jurors couldn't help but be impressed when he replicated the device and demonstrated its devastating results. Parsons' testimony was key to sending Kennett away for 10 years. Shaw became the first mayor in U.S. history tossed out in a recall. Some say that it was here that Parsons sowed the seeds of his own fiery destruction. Basking in the glow of his newfound recognition, Parsons was no doubt pleased to take a shot at City Hall's corruption. All his life, Parsons had been outraged by society's hypocrisy, dishonesty, and repression. It was another bond that he felt with Crowley, and one of the reasons that on February 15, 1941, Jack and Helen Parsons joined Crowley's ranks. Crowley had announced a new age, an age governed by a new law, Thelema, do what thou wilt. For Crowley and the Thelemites, this wasn't a call for anarchy. It was a demand on each person to discover their true will, their deepest calling, and the right to carry it out without the interference of others. This was not just magic to transform your life, but magic to change the world. If do what thou wilt is the whole of the law, then Crowley's message also said, love is the law, love under will.
Do what thou wilt.
It was a social message that Parsons endorsed, as do modern Thelemites.
It's obvious that we are in need of a great social change. We are obviously in need of a paradigm shift of the highest order in order to move us into a way of being that is completely beyond where we could possibly imagine things to be. A world of fullness, a world of abundance, a world of peace and harmony and joy and pleasure that just does not exist now. And in order to do this, we have to really release and let go of the way we have existed and find a new way of being. And for me, and many of my brothers and sisters, Thelema exists as that paradigm shift.
And Sir Aleister Crowley.
Parsons embraced the challenges of this strange new world he found himself in, just as he had always delighted in the challenges of his rocketry.
Are to come. May their essence be here, present, potent, puissant, and paternal.
Soon after Parsons joined the Order, the Suicide Squad informed the Army they would have a working Jet-O ready in a few months. But the week before a pilot would put them to the test, the rockets exploded. No one could understand what had suddenly gone wrong. If they couldn't solve the problem, they might lose their funding, and the test pilot would almost certainly lose his life. The stakes were high. These were weapons of war. Could jet-assisted takeoff ever be made to work? If Parsons couldn't solve the mystery of the exploding Jet-Os, the dream was doomed. On August 12, 1941, rocket-assisted takeoff was used for the first time to help a plane get off the ground. The misnamed Jet-O worked, but there was still a problem to solve. Without a more stable fuel, Jet-Os would never be more than a dangerous curiosity. With the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. entered the war and the pressures on the Suicide Squad only increased. They desperately needed to solve the mystery of the exploding Jet-Os. Again, Parsons' infallible intuition led him down paths no one else had ever dreamed of taking. A road right to a new and improved fuel that would usher in the space age. No one was laughing at the Rocketeers now. Among the companies Jack and his colleagues created were Aerojet and JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or as some called it, the Jack Parsons Lab. JPL is built on Arroyo Seco, where Jack and Ed had started. It remains a giant in the industry. There are those who say that it was this very success that spelled the doom of Jack Parsons.
Now, with government regulation came a whole host of scientists from chemistry, from physics, who were brought in to really start building more and more rockets for the government. And when they stepped in, they realized that Parsons and his colleagues, although they had started this whole thing off, although they had started rocketry off and they had given it its impetus when nobody else was interested in it, they just weren't the sort of people to work within a government agency. You know, Ed Foreman, Jack Parsons' friend, would turn up kind of bloodied from his latest motorcycle crash. Jack Parsons would turn up and start fooling around with all sorts of explosives he wasn't meant to. So slowly but surely, the powers that be started squeezing the original members, the original founders of rocketry in the United States, out. They were just seen as a liability to what would eventually become the military-industrial complex. And Parsons, with his previous kind of friendships with communists, with his interests and membership of a religious cult, was all too easy to squeeze out of the business.
He challenged conventional thinking. He challenged conventional social thinking. And the social mores of the time then were different from today. And as we know today, people are uncomfortable with alternative lifestyles.
Helen Northrop was Parsons' first wife. They had met in Pasadena at a church dance, and soon after were married, I think when Parsons was in his early 20s, 20, 21. And the two had stayed together. This was before Parsons was interested in magic or the occult, and they had had a happy life for the first few years in Pasadena. But then Parsons got involved in the O.T.O. and the occult life, and when he started, suggesting they sleep around and have an open relationship, Helen was, slightly nonplussed by this. But nevertheless, she went along with it. While Parsons went off sleeping with many of the O.T.O.'s characters, Helen ended up with the head of the O.T.O. at the time, who Parsons would later supplant, Wilfred Smith.
So Parsons led a very open, alternative lifestyle in the 30s, when it wasn't the thing to do. Now,
Things weren't helped by the fact that at the same time as Parsons was sleeping with other people, he was also sleeping with Helen's younger sister, Betty. It was a pretty messy household at the time. And although they remained on cordial terms, there was something between Jack and Helen which was never resolved. And this was this relationship with the sister. She thought that was a bridge too far. You can sleep around with other people, but not with my sister. But anyway, Parsons divorced Helen, and Helen took up with the head of the O.T.O., Wilfred Smith.
It seems unlikely that Crowley would have had any moral problem with these goings-on. However, he certainly didn't want his life's work reduced to a wife-swapping club. Crowley removed the head of the LA Lodge and replaced him with Jack. In their correspondence, Crowley often referred to Jack as his son, just as Jack called him father. His growing involvement in what is often dismissed as a black magic sex cult did more than raise some eyebrows. Before too long, Parsons was under police scrutiny, both for his alleged communist sympathies as well as these other questionable activities. By the time of his death, Parsons' FBI file covered hundreds of pages. Jack's dreams were coming true, but not as he had expected. His beloved rockets weren't taking man into space, but had become one more way of blowing up your neighbor. The science fiction version was doubtless more attractive.
So Parsons really started getting involved in the science fiction writing world, and he was invited along to kind of meetings of science fiction writers. He swapped stories, and in a couple of books there are kind of roman clefs of Parsons. There are depictions of Parsons in science fiction books. One of the books, written by a writer called Anthony Boucher, called Rocket to the Morgue, has an eccentric rocket scientist who ultimately tries to destroy his own invention and blows himself up in a very prophetic style for Parsons' own end. But so not only was he a fan of science fiction, he was a friend of the writers of science fiction, he was inspired by science fiction to build his rockets, and he was also a character in the very science fiction he loved.
He met this fellow named L. Ron Hubbard, a prolific science fiction writer at that time, and they got to be good buddies, Parsons and Hubbard.
It was through science fiction that they had met, but Hubbard would in a few years go beyond fiction to found Dianetics, and what was to become one of the most controversial of modern religious movements, Scientology.
Parsons at the time was living in a grand old house on South Orange Grove Avenue, where he had grown up, and he was renting out these different rooms to all people he found interesting. Now, when Hubbard came to live there, they began practicing magic together, but as the general rule of the house was Crowley's "do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," and as open relationships were generally, said to be okay by Crowley, Hubbard ended up sleeping with Betty, and despite Crowley's creed, Parsons couldn't restrain his jealousy.
Parsons tried desperately to rise above the emotional turmoil and maintain his friendship with both Betty and Hubbard.
They're even doing magical experiments together, and there's evidence of it with Parsons' writings, and that L. Ron Hubbard was a scribe while Parsons is doing black magic ritualism and so on, and there is L. Ron Hubbard's scribbling, looking to see if the Thelemic masters have come in and whether these ectoplasmic beings and these demonic beings have arrived.
To Jack, the most important conjuring that he and Hubbard would undertake must have been the summoning up of a replacement Betty, an elemental spirit in the guise of a woman. Some of Parsons' other magical rituals involved sex, and who or what would be a better partner than a magical creature? Parsons and his elemental would then not just summon up some demon, they were going to cause a goddess to incarnate, the goddess Babalon.
In Aleister Crowley's system, there's the Beast 666, and there's Babalon. Babalon is sort of the dark female goddess. Parsons saw this force as like the necessary next step for human evolution, was to bring about this Babalon force on Earth.
All of this was perplexing, not just to the uninitiated, but also to many of Parsons' colleagues and friends. Crowley himself didn't approve. He thought Jack was losing his way. Parsons returned to the desert and received the Book of Babalon, which he saw as an extension of Crowley's revelation. If Crowley was, in his challenge to Christian lies and hypocrisy, the great beast, Parsons would declare himself the Antichrist. On January 18, 1946, having returned from the desert and the evocations of the elemental spirit, he found Marjorie Cameron at his door. His elemental was, as he dreamt, red-haired, green-eyed. There was no doubt in his mind, he wrote to Crowley, "I have my elemental, fiery and subtle, determined and obstinate, sincere and perverse, with extraordinary personality and intelligence." She participates in his sex magic, but not because she believes in it, at first. Meanwhile, Parsons' relationship with Hubbard became increasingly complex.
He tried to convince Parsons to invest his money in a project to go and buy yachts in Miami and sail them around through the Panama Canal and then sell them in Los Angeles. And Parsons had invested his entire fortune gained from his rocketry work and so on in this company. But no sooner had Hubbard gone to Miami to buy the boats that he started refusing to return Parsons' calls, and it was pretty clear at that point, at least witnesses at the time say, that Hubbard had ran off with not only with Parsons' girlfriend, but with his money.
In a cable, Crowley wrote, "Suspect Ron playing confidence trick. Jack Parsons, weak fool. Obvious victim. Prowling swindlers." Hearing this, Parsons used his last few dollars to get to Miami. Hubbard and Betty had bought 3 yachts. Parsons tracked one of them down to a public dock. He went to court and obtained a temporary injunction to stop the sale of the yachts. 4 days later, Parsons received a call from the marina that one of the yachts had sailed. Parsons didn't give up. He turned to magic. In his hotel room, he performed this invocation of the spirit Bartsebal.
Wherein I shall set up thy throne of justice. Bartsebal, 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 come forth and manifest beyond the bars, forth from the palace of seraphic stars. Come, O thou, Bartsebal, the spirit of Mars. Come, I unbind thee from the chains of hell.
He later wrote Crowley, "At the same time, as far as I can check, his ship was struck by a sudden squall off the coast, which ripped off his sails and forced him back to port, where, of course, Jack was waiting for them."
So whether it was due to luck or to magic, Parsons managed to retrieve his money, if not his friendship with Hubbard.
As with all things, there is more than one interpretation of these events. In 1969, the Church of Scientology revealed that Hubbard had been sent by the U.S. military to infiltrate the cult that Parsons was part of.
He was on a mission from naval intelligence, say the Church of Scientology, to destroy black magic in America and save the reputation of this wonderful woman, Betty.
Whatever the explanation, there is no doubt that it was a time of changes for all concerned. The next month, Betty and Hubbard married. On October 14th, Parsons married Cameron. His elemental had proven to be much more than a partner in some sex magic rituals.
With Cameron, as with L. Ron Hubbard, Jack found people that understood him to a certain degree and welcomed his explorations or experimentations in magic. So he found in Cameron someone that would go with him to this place that he was seeking to go magically.
Cameron gained a reputation as an artist, and in the 50s and 60s would become important in the LA beat scene.
Unfortunately, the two weren't terribly suited to each other. Parsons was very fragile mentally at the time, having been excluded from so many of his core interests. And Cameron wasn't one to, or she rather entered into the spirit of do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law with more vigor than Parsons ever had. She ended up running down to Mexico, sleeping with a matador down in Mexico somewhere, and Parsons realized that he hadn't just conjured up, his perfect wife, he'd conjured up this woman who was going to push him to the limits of his sanity.
In 1947, the latest FBI investigation led to Parsons being declared an undesirable employee for national defense work. It left him almost unemployable. It took 2 years, but things were starting to look up. Jack's security clearance was returned, along with his back pay. Then he was approached by the emerging state of Israel to help them start a rocket program. At the time, Parsons was working for Howard Hughes Aircraft Company. In preparing his report for the Israelis, he asked a secretary at Hughes Aircraft to type up some of his handwritten notes. This led to accusations of espionage, and the FBI moved to prosecute. Cameron, hearing of his troubles, returned to be with him. It would take another 2 years for the charges to be dropped. But this ordeal had robbed Jack of more than just time.
He was reduced to making explosive squibs for Hollywood films. So that's how the man who founded the American rocketry complex was ended his life as a special effects designer.
As interesting as a rocket program in Israel sounded, nothing was certain. In any case, Israel could wait. Now free to travel, Cameron and Jack decided to first go to Mexico.
They were planning to leave the country. They were going to Mexico, Cameron and Jack. And Cameron went out to gas up the car.
While Cameron was out, Jack went to fill a last-minute order from a movie studio that needed some special effects explosives.
The last person to see Parsons alive was his lodger who lived in the same building as Parsons' laboratory. His name was Greg Gansey. Now, Gansey recalls going down into the garage where Parsons did his chemical work and seeing Parsons stirring various pots and clicking various funnels. And he said to Parsons in a jocular tone, "Whatever you do, Jack, don't blow us up." And the last words he remembers Parsons saying as Greg walked up the stairs back to his apartment was, "Don't worry, everything's okay." Then the next thing Greg Gansey remembers is a giant explosion taking place. He's in his apartment upstairs. The grand piano he has in his apartment is lifted off the ground and shatters to the ground. He rushes downstairs, and with his colleague, they find Parsons on the floor. But somehow Parsons was still alive. They called for the ambulance. The police came. Parsons was taken to our hospital, but his injuries were too severe, and he died within an hour. Now, curiously enough, to add even more tragedy to the day, once Parsons' mother, who was still alive, was told that Parsons had died, she took an overdose of sleeping pills and killed herself. So she died 3 hours after her son. It was a very strange and tragic day in Pasadena. Now, why did he die?
Many still refuse to believe the official explanation that his death was just a tragic accident. To the mystery of Parsons' death, some answer, perhaps with tongue-in-cheek.
We thought, well, possibly Parsons conjured up a fire devil with all of these explosives around, and that's what blew him up.
Others argue it was murder at the hands of a cop Parsons had sent upriver.
Was that explosion in which he died the result of that detective gaining vengeance on Jack Parsons?
The cops he had helped send away had been found guilty of exactly that, blowing up people who got in their way. One of them, Captain Canet, had been released from prison a few days earlier.
Cameron always believed that Howard Hughes was behind Jack's death, believe it or not, and which could be plausible.
Jack had been working for Hughes. He'd been fired for removing classified documents. Did Parsons possess industrial secrets that were too valuable to have knocking about? Could similar concerns have motivated a political assassination? Military intelligence must have been worried about this loose cannon leaving the country, given the secrets he had in his head.
One can't be certain, but I think that's just as well. One may lean towards the accident, but I don't think one needs to actually make any final conclusions about Parsons' death.
One thing is certain. Some years earlier, Parsons had, with uncanny foresight, written to Crowley, "Babalon is incarnate on the earth today, awaiting the proper hour of her manifestation. And in that day, my work will be accomplished, and I will be blown away upon the breath of the fire."
Preachers on TV tell me I'm living wrong, but I've tasted the lips of sweet Babylon.